Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second part of my conversation with Helen Thompson. We are talking geopolitics, and we are talking about the weirdness of living in a world so dominated by American power. This conversation is about what that means in the age of Donald Trump. But it's not just about Trump. It's not just about Venezuela and Greenland and all the rest, though we do cover that. It's also about what might happen as the contest between America and China ramps up and what it means for everyone else. Helen, this conversation is going to be about American power in the 21st century, but in the light of what we were talking about last time, and I suppose there is still a question about weirdness and where we want to draw the boundaries of what should and shouldn't be expected. It seems to me like there are two questions here. There's a bigger one and a smaller one. I think the smaller one for most people looms larger, the smaller one being to what extent is Trump an outlier in the longer story of American power. But the larger question is really about the 21st century. So we described something that happened in the 19th century, which was very unusual in world history. In the 20th century, something that felt a little bit more, not inevitable, but it had a momentum of its own, which politics shaped, as it always does, but in some respects, the momentum carried it through. To start with the question of what might have changed in the 21st century before we get on to what might have changed with the second administration of Donald Trump, do you think we are still essentially in the framework of the 20th century story? Or do you think in the 21st century something has shifted? Either in relation to the resource questions that we talked about, the kind of predetermined arc of this that we discussed. Does the 21st century, do you think, actually stand outside the story that we described last time, or is it obviously a continuation of it?
I think that it's both. I think that it's both because it's a continuing resource story, but it's got such a radical difference to it in China that means that we're no longer living under the conditions of the 20th century. But I think what's interesting is, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to think about this over probably about the last year now, is it is, I think, tied to the 19th century story, because I think, and this goes back to your framing, David, earlier, the weirdness bit of the US story, is because I think the weirdness of the US story and the weirdness of the China story kind of converge at the end of the 19th century, and they're sort of interacting with each other. So China, the end of the 19th century, imperial China is in its twilight years. It's being in part broken up, at least at the coastal areas, like Shanghai becoming an international city, loss of Hong Kong, etc. That's happened. And that means that when the United States is rising as geopolitical power in the Pacific, that what might historically have been expected to be the check on that can't be. Indeed, in some sense, it's driving the US's, at least commercial expansion into the Pacific, wanting its share, if you like, of China. So if you then skip to the beginning of the 21st century, and then you've got the United States, that's the world's dominant geopolitical power, but with quite a lot of problems, and then you bring China back into this story, and then you remember that China is at that point still the world's most populous country, and obviously it's still one of the two most populous countries by some distance over everybody else. And then you think about China needing to become dependent upon resources from abroad, particularly oil, but not only oil. So its stocks becoming self-sufficient in oil from 1993. That's a pretty heady mix that's coming into play in the beginning of the 21st century. And in some sense, it's kind of showing, I think, the weirdness of the whole period of the United States as a geopolitical power, because it's dependent upon the absent China, or the humiliated China, to use, if you want to use the language of the century, humiliation. But because resources are so important, and particularly oil and gas, and that you enter the 21st century when you're already quite some way, well, you were centuries worth into those energy sources, China is going to be playing catch up with that in order to reach anything comparable in terms of level of economic development. And I think that we put all that together, that's an almighty shock to the US position. And I think, as I say, it's part of a continuous story because you can just tell it in the way in which I did, albeit that it's complicated. But at the same time, I think it just fundamentally changes something that means we're severed from the 20th century world because we have not, none of us in the world in a way, have lived in this globe in which you have the kind of United States, you have the kind of China that is now here, and we're still on this trajectory of ever increasing resource consumption.
So there are so many things that might come out of that, but one of them is about time frame. So we talked about, relatively speaking, the speed of the transition from a United States, a continental state, being formed into its creation as a global power through the 19th century, how fast that was, how dramatic it was, how violent it was. And the rise of Rome was pretty fast, dramatic, and violent. All of these things are relative. The rise of Great Britain as a global power was, in some respects, quite quick. But there's something about that almost mid-19th century American story that feels like there's a speed to it. There's a rate of change which is quite hard to fathom. What's so weird in a way about the Chinese story is it's both quicker. I mean, it is quicker, and there is a millennial long aspect to it. And China is both clearly, in geopolitical terms, a much more enduring power than the United States of America is. It's the comparisons that we were making in the 16th century, the 17th century. At the end of the 17th century, we didn't talk about this, but someone looking from Europe would be looking to China as a place that might, so conceivably, as you suggested, you might think if something's coming from nowhere, it might be Mexico. But if something's not coming from nowhere, but is going to be powerful as it has been for a long time, it would be China. So there is that long story of Chinese power within which something has happened, which is far quicker even than the American rise. And that in itself is very disorienting. America both is a more durable thing than recent Chinese power, and it's also a much more transient thing than Chinese power.
Yeah, and I think that trying to work out what the implications of that is hard. But there's another aspect of it, though, that I think that we do have to think about, which is that China is going back to that period in a way, territorially, in the same way in which the United States is in terms of being now a territorially expansionist power, which I think we have to now accept that that's what it is under Donald Trump. Because China thinks it's got unfinished business from its losses at that point, the 1890s, meaning Taiwan. And actually, if you go a little bit more long term, where this might go, you would say Russia as well, because obviously that has not been undone in terms of the Russian expansion to the Pacific and the territory that it took from China in doing that. So China is still, in a way, incomplete from its point of view in relation to that history. The United States isn't incomplete in relation to that history. It's just going back under Trump to a mindset that's tied to those decades in which it's like the United States needs to be bigger. And that's why I just think that it's not simply a question of the length of time of China in relation to the brevity of the United States if we're looking at from world history. I think you're completely right about that. But I still think in terms of where that they are now, there is a difference between this US must be bigger under Trump and the China position of we haven't quite finished working out what those decades did to us. Now, given that then that island, Taiwan, if you look at its geography in relation to the nature of US power in the Pacific, then that's also highly consequential for the ability of the United States to remain a Pacific power in the long term. So you could say that actually just the working out of this in maritime terms in particular has still got some way to go yet.
So does that make the world that we're in now, so it's unusual in our lifetimes, for sure, but it may be that our lifetimes is the outlier, that period of relatively unchallenged American dominance was particularly unusual, and it created all sorts of illusions about American power as well, probably about its relative stability or about the way in which it understood itself. So that to get to the question, which I imagine is the one that people are most interested in, whether Trump himself or what he is doing is an outlier in this story. If you look at the 21st century trajectory here, do you think particularly Trump 2.0 feels like it is an extension of something that was already happening? We can talk, and we will talk, about the way he frames it, the way the administration justifies it, the absence, among other things, of hypocrisy in it, which is hypocrisy is a good thing. So the absence of hypocrisy is not necessarily a good thing. But in the 21st century arc, do you take Trump 2.0 to mark in itself a juncture, or should we understand it as part of something that was already underway?
The difficulty with this, and it's always a question of everything to do with Trump, is I don't think it's at all difficult to put Trump as an outcome, let's call it that, into this world history frame that we've been talking about. And I think if you say, was it likely that in the middle of the 2020s, given the nature of the geopolitical competition between the United States and China and Russia's part in it and the melting of the ice in the Arctic, is it surprising that there's a president in the White House that wants to strengthen geopolitically the United States' position in the Arctic, and that would bring into play not only the question of Greenland, but the relationship between the United States and Canada? I think that, yeah, it would be odd not to think that that was the case. I mean, both because if you look at the fact that, you go back to the Obama administration, that there's an Arctic strategy being articulated, because in many ways, Putin had geopoliticized the Arctic back in like 2007, when he, been pretty explicit that this was going to be a Russian priority. And then you can see Chinese moves in the 2010 saying that they're a near Arctic state they're calling themselves. And then you look some of the things that gone on in terms of Canada's relationship with China, before Trump came in to play. All those things, I think, would suggest that a version of what is happening would happen. Not necessarily immediately, but in some context, at some point. The difficulty is, as we know, it's just Trump himself, because it's very difficult to imagine anybody else who could possibly have been president of the United States in 2026 talking in the way in which he does and pursuing it in quite the way in which he does. And this is why I think you constantly have to kind of like step back from the drama of it and the extraordinarily weird personality of Donald Trump himself and say, is there something structural going on here? And most of the time, I think, in fact, almost all the time, the answer is yes. If you take Greenland, because obviously that's central at the moment, if you go back to like 1867, it's the first time that the United States tries to take Greenland. The context is that it comes immediately after Russia has sold Alaska to the United States. And that brings to an end what had previously been, the presence of Russia in the Americas as far down south as San Francisco, down the Pacific coast. And the context for that is back in Eurasia, because Britain's just defeated Russia in the Crimean War. And the Russians are, in a sense, trying to geopolitically balance for their defeat there by putting some pressure on Canada. Or it's not Canada yet, it's about to become the Canadian Confederation. So you've got the Arctic coming into play in terms of British-Russian relations. That then affects what happens in the United States about Greenland. It brings about the Confederation of Canada. Then that leads to some people in the United States wanting actually to take what is now Canadian territory as part of the United States. Greenland next comes up in the build-up to the First World War, comes up in the First World War itself, when the United States, the administration is interested in buying Greenland and settles for the Danish West Indies, what's now the US Virgin Islands. It comes during the Second World War because the United States takes it to stop Germany getting it. It comes in the beginning of the Cold War when Truman administration tries to buy it, effectively signs a treaty that gives de facto military sovereignty in Greenland to the US. And Eisenhower is not satisfied with that. There are people in the Eisenhower administration who want to buy Greenland. So every geopolitical juncture or major one that you can think of, there's a Greenland story to it. So if the Arctic's become geopoliticized, which I don't think anybody thinks that it hasn't, then you would expect US interest in Greenland again. But again, can you imagine anybody else writing that letter that Trump has written? Just no. And then that's always the point that I get stuck at.
But it's almost as well. So the letter that Trump wrote, the way he communicates, thank you for your attention, is very 21st century. But that story of Greenland that you described, the 20th century versions of it through leasing and treaties and compromises, and there might have been a bit of grandstanding, but it was basically that version of high strategic geopolitics in which people danced around in order to achieve outcomes that weren't optimal, but were the best they could get. Whereas Trump is doing this more like 19th century American politics. It's territorial. It's explicitly territorial. It's about the map. The AI mock-ups that he creates, where you've got a United States flag on Greenland, and he's making the leaders of Europe look at it and swallow their pride, humble pie, don't know what they have to swallow, everything. It's like the 21st century and the 19th century, and a lot of people have made this point about Trump, but they usually make it in relation to McKinley, but it's the long sweep of the century itself. It's like 19th century politics and indeed 19th century political rhetoric, some of it, being played out in the 21st century. And that does seem to make it different from the 20th century version where, yeah, Greenland is going to be important. Of course it's going to be important in all sorts of different contexts, particularly, as you said, 2 world wars and then a proxy world war, the Cold War. But the Trump version of it, it's like the 20th century didn't exist. And this is the 19th century version of it. It's so much more brazen. It's so much more territorial. It's so much more like conquest than it is like treaty.
I think if we just stick with Greenland for a moment, the reason why it's going to look more like conquest and may even yet turn out actually to be conquest is because what it brings with it now, the Greenland question I mean by that, is something that is consequential for US relations more generally with the European states. So the reason why I think the Truman administration could be satisfied with what it got, even though, say, Eisenhower administration tried to go back to the table on it, is because the Truman administration had accepted NATO, and indeed, they'd inaugurated NATO. And that transaction, if you like, that was made between the Americans and the West European states, that the United States would give security guarantees within this collective security architecture, was accepted. I mean, I know that the French under de Gaulle chipped away at it, but that notion that the United States would accept it had to, in some sense, take direct responsibility for the security of West European states, and that West European governments would accept that that is what the United States was doing, and then would accept the benefits that came from that. That was a given. As I say, the de Gaulle story accepted. But that's not a given any longer. It's certainly not a given on the United States side. So you could say, and I think this is partly is what's going on in this case, is that Trump is also using the Greenland issue as a way of pressing hard on that fault line that runs straight down NATO now, in which it's not at all clear that the United States is still committed in a world in which it has to deal with China to this collective security arrangement for Western Europe, and now much more than Western Europe, that it entered into, first of all, in 1949. And what Greenland does is to put intense pressure on that, because of effectively the European defence, and it's not just the Danish defence, it's the European defence, is, well, what's your problem? You can do what you like here. You've got as much military discretion as you want on Greenland, so why do you need sovereignty? And the Trumpian answer to that is because you're kidding yourselves if you think you've got sovereignty if you can't do security. And that's why I think he's kind of disruptive, because I think part of it, I mean, who knows with him, but possibly, he's just, in some sense, trying to wind them up about it, if you see what I mean. He's just poking at this weakness in the European position, which goes to the heart of the whole nature of security in Europe. And it's also bound up with the Ukraine war. I had kind of thought about the comparison between the Crimean War and what happened in 1867 and now this, but you could perhaps make the comparison. And so in that sense, I think part of what is going on, if you go back to big picture now, is the unraveling of the weirdness of NATO. That this idea that a state in the Western Hemisphere would give security guarantees under a collective security architecture to West European states that, still in the case of Britain, are still imperial powers, for goodness sake, at this point. That is historically odd, I think, if you really think about it.
And the real oddness there is the existence of NATO becoming the background fact, the template against which other much more contingent forms of politics play out. Now, there have often been alliances like NATO, but they're not background facts. They're not defaults that you take for granted and then you do politics in the light of that. They are the foreground fact. They are, like you say, where the fault lines are. If you're in a complicated, difficult world with high stakes power politics being played on the global stage, these alliances aren't things that anyone can take for granted. And that does, in leaving Trump out of it, that does in a way feel like the weird period of NATO, which is the taking for granted of NATO, to go back to NATO's not finished, but it's now it's a source of contention. It's not something that anyone can simply start from and then work out their position in the light of the fact that NATO exists. That feels more, in broader historical terms, for want of a better word, normal. Though the way Trump does it is very abnormal for us, and I suspect would be abnormal even in the 19th century, some of it. But making NATO the place where these arguments might play out is not abnormal.
I don't think it is at all. Not at all. It has to be about the manner in which he does it, the rhetoric in which he explains what he wants to do. I think that the point where you can say that what we've just said isn't quite sufficient is probably Canada, because you've got to go to something longer ago than NATO to unpack what's going on there. In a way, that's revisiting the history of the 18th century and the fact that that border is settled, not entirely, obviously, by the end of the Revolutionary War with Britain, because the 1812 war comes into it too, but it's a product of that period of history rather than the product of the later period. So by Trump pressurizing that, he's pressurizing something that's much older than what he's pressurizing on the NATO fault line. But I think on the NATO point is that it's forcing to the surface of politics the, let's just call it, historical contingency of NATO.
One thing that I think stands out about what's going on at the moment in relation to the very long-term view that we talked about last time is that these flashpoints, the actions that the Trump administration are taking or are threatening to take, are in the Western Hemisphere. And part of the weirdness of American power is that for most of human history, the Western Hemisphere is not the center of the world. The Western Hemisphere is extremely important, and many fights that are anchored in Eurasia might play out there. But in the period of American power, the most powerful state on earth is a Western Hemisphere state. But during that period, the Western Hemisphere is not where the action is. The action is elsewhere, and the action is for much of the 20th century in Europe. But it's also imperial power struggles around the world, and it's also in the second half of the 20th century in Asia, and the contest is with Russia. But now, first in Venezuela, with the threats over Greenland, putting pressure on the Canadian border, the Western Hemisphere, and when you look at a map of the world, I did it just before we started, just Google it. The Western Hemisphere is all ocean, and then Greenland, and then depending on where you draw it, but usually it includes the United Kingdom and the edge of Western Europe, but it's the Americas. And the Eastern Hemisphere is everything else. There's more land, apart from anything else. There's more ocean in the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot more landmass in the Eastern Hemisphere. There's massively more population in the Eastern Hemisphere. I mean, it doesn't even compare. So if in the third decade of the 21st century, the Western Hemisphere is now becoming where the big fights are starting to happen, is that in itself unusual? How should we think about that? I'm not sure how to think about that. From the way you've described it, it does still feel like it would be a mistake to think of this, as Trump might frame it, as America drawing the world back into its hemisphere. Actually, these things only really make sense seen in a much broader global context. But nonetheless, it is one of the odd features of the politics of now, how Western hemispherical, if that's a word or a phrase, it is.
Yeah, but I think that this is a China question too. That's part of the reason why you have the focus from the Americans under Trump on the Western Hemisphere. Because China, as a trading power, actually in driving its growth in the 90s and into the 2000s through a focus on US markets, orientated itself Western Hemisphere rather than Eurasia. Now, you can say then with Belt and Road from like 2013, that was a turn away from Western Hemisphere to Eurasia.
to an older story, a kind of the Silk Road, the classic version.
Absolutely. But I think the truth is that it's also a misleading story to think that that's what China did, because now the Belt and Road, even that language of the Belt and Road and the finance initiatives, etc., behind it goes into Latin America. So actually, there may have been a bit of a reorientation between the US and Europe in terms of Chinese trade investment priorities, but it's actually doubled down on the Western Hemisphere in terms of its economic and its resource development. It's just that it's now across the Americas and not just the United States. And this is also, I think, where the Canada part comes into it and the Mexico part. So if you go back to Trump 1 and you look at what he was doing on reconstructing NAFTA into whatever its new name is, I've forgotten now. The rationale for that was trying to align Canada and Mexico up in trade terms in a we are going to confront China approach from the US on trade. And this is obviously still an issue because you can see it in the way in which Trump's engaged with Mexico in particular this time round, of not wanting Canada and Mexico to be backdoors for China into the United States when China's fighting a trade war with it. Then when you add in the fact that in terms of resources, the Western Hemisphere is particularly important at the moment, all the growth in oil production essentially since around 2005 is coming out of the Western Hemisphere. Not just the US shale boom, but in recent years, Brazil and Guyana, increasingly Argentinian shale. Plus, the most important metals for the energy transition, lithium and copper, particularly lithium, are disproportionately in the Southern Hemisphere and in terms of actual production at the moment, Latin American countries. So you've got China deeply commercially engaging in the Western Hemisphere, tying that to resources because the resources there are the growth areas at the moment. And it's pretty easy, I think, to see why, in the end, any US administration, unless they're going to repudiate the Monroe Doctrine, is going to turn around and say that this is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine from their point of view. That, they don't want Chinese commercial power in the Western Hemisphere any more than they wanted British or German power in Mexico when the oil was being discovered.
Last time we talked about the illusion, which in many ways it is, of self-sufficiency on the part of a continental state, and how there was never really a moment where, though the illusion is powerful, it came into focus as a plausible reality. But it is the case that the United States has quite recently in its history become a net exporter of fossil fuel energy, and that creates at least another version of the illusion, I guess, of self-sufficiency. How significant is that in this? I still take it that it's an illusion, not least because there are many more things at play in the world now than merely fossil fuels, and copper and lithium, as you just described, are as important in this story as anything else. But do you think part of what's going on here does come out of the change in the energy dependency position of the United States in very recent times?
I think that the United States would not have been able to exercise power in the way in which it's done over the last 15 years or so if you take the shale oil and gas boom out of it. I mean, just take one simple example. Is the United States was not competing with Russia for European gas markets before the middle of the last decade. Now it is, and it's winning. And that's part of the weakness that European states now have in dealing with the Trump administration, I think, because they are more energy dependent upon the United States than they were even 4 years ago. And the alternative to being this dependent upon the United States for gas is to become more dependent on Russia for gas again. And that puts European states in a pretty difficult position. And I think it wouldn't be possible, I would go as far as saying, for Trump to be this confrontational with the European states in a context in which the United States didn't have this advantage and Europe this weakness.
So framing it like that, one of the questions that's often asked of any great power, but for us it's usually asked of the United States, is whether its power has peaked. Now, on that account, just on that account, clearly it's facing a much more formidable rival in China. But just on that account, in some respects, it's more powerful even than it was 4 years ago. And that does have a lot to do with raw questions of energy and net resources. Do you think American power still has some way to go up in that respect? Is it possible to frame what we've talked about the last couple of decades as a peak of American power? I mean, obviously, in many ways, it's not what it was in the 20th century. And in some respects, it has peaked, including as a cultural power, I would say, for sure. Not entirely. I mean, it still has a lot of cultural pull because of Silicon Valley, but relative to my childhood, I think American cultural power has peaked. But raw geopolitical power, is it possible to talk about a peak here?
I think that the United States does have a problem where energy is concerned because the peak of the US shale oil boom is very much in sight, unless new fields are brought into play. And I think that is one context, I think only one context, in which Venezuela has assumed the importance that it has for the Trump administration. I mean, that's very long term because the state of the Venezuelan oil industry and the difficulties of extracting and particularly refining Venezuelan oil. And so I think that if we just stick in fossil fuel terms, the United States is not, it's perhaps around peak energy power. The complication, of course, is that we're now in a different world than one that we've seen before in energy geopolitical terms, I think, because China is certainly not repudiating fossil fuels, anything but. But at the same time, it is more strongly committed than the United States is to electrification and is significantly further down that road. I mean, it's still, official figures are probably unreliable, but maybe 30% of total Chinese energy consumption is now electricity, where it's nearer 20% in the United States. Now, if it were possible, I know I'm somewhat skeptical about this for reasons you know, but really to make electricity the central energy form and do that in ways which matter in terms of, well, matter for militaries, essentially, which is where the difficulty of this, I think, comes in. Then you could say, well, actually, the United States, under Trump, in repudiating the energy transition, because I think that that is what has happened, is weakening itself. I think that it's much more likely that we are in a world in which we're going to see a continuation of multiple energy sources and therefore multiple geopolitical conflicts around multiple energy sources. Because if you took a view which was, look, the future is electrification, and that is also going to be how geopolitical power is exercised in energy terms, then China is going to win in the end. But I'm not convinced really that that is the case, or at least I think it's a very, very complicated question. And in timelines that we can imagine, I think that that is quite difficult to see how it plays out in terms of electricity being the most important geopolitical energy source.
So you're not saying, to take the 20th century comparison, when we talked about the early 20th century, you're very clear you didn't want to tell a straightforwardly deterministic story, but still, from the early 20th century, it was at least possible, with the benefit of hindsight, to see an arc of historical development in which the United States' ascendancy to being the dominant power on this planet looked relatively baked in. So here we are, we're not at the beginning of the 21st century, but we're nearer the beginning than we are to the end. Some people, I think, would think that we are close to being able to tell a similar story about the arc of power in this century, with China's rise to global dominance being similarly baked in. And a large part of that is the electrification story, the story about batteries, the story about the ways in which these two superpowers are placing their bets on the future. You think it's more contingent than that from where we stand now? Of course, we don't have the benefit of hindsight, and maybe in 1926 it would have looked similarly uncertain. It's only hindsight that seems to tell us how it cashes out. But still, you don't think it's the same kind of arc from where we stand?
This is why I think that there's a clear difference that we can already see, though there is a little bit of contingency you can bring into this. Let's say it's 1912. I'm picking this year for a reason. because it's the year that Winston Churchill, who's head of the Admiralty, whatever the cabinet position is at the time, takes a decision that Britain's going to build oil warships. And he knows it's an extremely dangerous thing for Britain to do because Britain doesn't have any oil domestically. It's got oil fields, imperial oil fields in Burma, and oil's been discovered in Persia, and it's under control of a British company, but it's not producing any oil at the time. Now, the thing is that Churchill has been convinced, people who convinced him of this are quite right, that oil warships are going to do better than coal warships. They're going to be more powerful. So his view is Britain's going to stay a geopolitical power, preferably the most powerful in the world. So it needs to have the most powerful warships in the world, and we'll just try and fix somehow where the oil is coming from. And this is, I think, really clear when you see it as Trump repudiating the energy transition. Anybody who then gets to the parallel and says, okay, it's electricity, first of all, it's not at all clear that electricity is going to be more powerful as a means of aeroplanes and ships than oil. In fact, it's now, right now, you're not going to fight with electric planes because they don't exist, or not the kind that they'll fight wars. And the United States is not adjusting to what is deemed to be the new energy source under Trump. It's saying, no, we're going to stick with where our advantages are, which is oil and gas. So the equivalent for Britain in 1912 would have been to say, well, we're just going to stick with coal because we have lots of it. We have coal stations around the globe. And interestingly, there are people in the 1920s who are saying that it was the wrong thing to do because why on earth was Britain making itself dependent upon an energy source that was so difficult for it? But that's what the point, I think, where, there isn't a parallel, because the parallel would be if China got ahead on the energy transition and electricity, and the response in Washington is we must catch up. Now, you could say maybe that's what the Biden administration mindset was. I think they were more playing it both ways, to be honest. But we can see really clearly that that is not Trump's administration's position. The Trump administration's position is double down on US advantages now. And I would say probably try and make China pay for its weaknesses in the energy regime of now. And that includes weakening the regimes where it is used to being getting oil from. Now, Venezuela's small scale in terms of where China's imports are coming from, about 4% of China's imports. But, Iran, that's a different proposition. Russia, Saudi Arabia, can you turn them away from China? It's a very different way of dealing with what seems an ascendant power than the one that the British adopted in 1912.
And it is also the case that China, in playing to its strengths, is not just gambling on electricity and battery life, it's also extracting more coal than has ever happened at any time in human history. So you do, in a way, have a contest between the 20th century, which is Trump, and the 19th plus 21st, which is China. Coal plus electricity, and electricity here meaning the kind of electricity that might be powered by sun or wind, and with batteries that could sustain that and maybe even fly planes and drive ships in future. Is that the world that we're in? In a way, has Trump, of course this isn't all Trump, we use Trump as a shorthand for his administration, but is the Trump administration in a way giving us something which everything is weird in this world, but one of the things that we are looking at is a contest between the 20th century and a 19th, 21st hybrid? As you say, I think it's a really interesting what if. What if Churchill had gone the other way? What would have happened to British power if Churchill had decided to do the Trump strategy and just say, we play to our strengths. What matters is not to be dependent on an energy source in geopolitical terms. Would British power have lasted longer? Because it didn't last for long, let's be honest. Churchill's strategy did not extend the shelf life of Britain as a global power for long. It could hardly have gone worse in some ways if you just leave out the other side of the Churchill story. Or is what I've offered too cartoonishly crude?
I think you can see what the alternative strategy was, which is what some people are wanting by the 1920s, which is synthetic fuel, which is essentially making an oil equivalent from coal. It's what the Germans do. The Germans work out how to do it. It starts at scale under Weimar, and it's completely taken over by the Nazis. It's massively important to Hitler, and we know what purposes it was put to, and the relationship of the companies that did that, IG Farben, to the concentration camps. I mean, they say, well, it doesn't have to turn out like that for Britain. It's where I think gets into quite difficult territory of how to think about the geopolitics of the first 4 decades of the 20th century around these questions. I think the thing that is missing from what we've talked about so far in the story is nuclear power, which is a 20th century. And it's an area where China has done a lot better in recent decades than the United States in terms of its sheer ability to build nuclear reactors. It's an area in which the Trump administration is very committed to redeveloping American energy power in. It has a problem because, it's dependent upon uranium and enriched uranium quite a bit, even through the Ukraine war, has come from Russia. So it's a story that exposes quite a number of US weaknesses. It does matter in geopolitical terms because nuclear-powered submarines. And I think perhaps that is part of the explanation of the more general resurgence of nuclear power over the last 5-6 years, maybe a bit longer. I think what it suggests is that those thinking in energy terms within the Trump administration do not think that the US fossil fuel advantages are sufficient in energy terms, including probably in geopolitical terms. And that I would say it's as much part of US energy strategy under Trump as doubling down on fossil fuels and repudiating the solar wind energy transition.
Where does Europe stand then in the world that we are in now? In the sense that there are, as you've suggested, some pretty tough choices facing European leaders, and they are going to be making those choices under conditions of weakness, all kinds of weakness, including demographic weakness, but China faces its own demographic weaknesses. I mean, one of the things about the speed that all of these things are happening is that phenomena that take centuries in previous centuries are happening in decades now, one of which is China going through the demographic transition. So just a few days ago, the number of births in China was announced, and despite everything that the Chinese government is doing, it is falling off a cliff. I read an article a couple of days ago about how narrow the window is in which Vietnam has got to continue its breakneck economic growth before it just runs out of workers, because birth rates will plummet so quickly that Vietnam will also be in a position of dependency. In population terms, too many non-working people dependent on the work of too few working age people. So this is going on everywhere in the world, and it's going on faster in China than it is in the United States, but it's going on faster in Europe even than it is in China. So Europe's got all sorts of weaknesses. Is Europe now facing, do you think, a choice it has to place its bets on one or other of these visions? And if it does have to place its bets on one or other of these visions, and the weirdness of the period in which NATO was the default, and you just take that as your starting point, and then you place your bets given the fact of NATO. Now NATO is not the default. Now everything is in play. Do you think Europe faces a real choice here as to which way to go?
Yeah, it does. But I think you can't think about that without bringing in the Russia question, because right now, the West European states, I would say, more committed to an independent Ukraine than they have ever been in history. Necessarily, that's a question about Europe's relations with Russia. And I think that any scenario in which the European states, individually and collectively in particular, choose China over the United States, well, that is also de facto choosing Russia. At just the point when, let's just take Germany, because it was the one that obviously had the most consequential, deep relationship with Russia, not just, I would say, through the post-Cold War period, but through the last decade and a half or so of the Cold War period. And you require a reset on that whole matter to be able to veer off in the direction of China. But you require it in terms of sacrificing Ukraine, but to some extent you also require it when you're at the China end of it, because China and Russia are allies, not least about Ukraine. So I think it's a harder choice than just saying, okay, you go in the US way or the China way.
But do you think the mindset, I completely take that point, and the commitment to Ukraine is a political commitment made by politicians on the basis of a whole set of factors that are aspects of their respective political judgments. They could choose differently. Nothing about it is predetermined. But do you think, relative to the story of our lifetimes, of how Europeans, the countries that we are familiar with, the country that we grew up in, the country that we live in, tend to construct their view of the world, what are the defaults and what are the realistic options? Ukraine is a big barrier in the way of making that shift. So something else would have to shift to go with it, and that might be very, very difficult. But do you think the space has opened up politically, intellectually, imaginatively for these now to be real questions? Or are we still, and Trump is driving this, no doubt Trump is driving people to question things they hadn't questioned before. But it still feels to me like we are more in the era of weird American power where American power sets the defaults than we are quite yet in a world in which these things are genuinely open questions. I might be wrong. And it's different than it was 5 years ago. It's different than it was 2 years ago. It's definitely different than it was 20 years ago. But still, the leap to thinking essentially there are, in resource and energy terms, two paths. America has placed a bet here. China, as you've said, it's a 19th, 20th plus 21st century bet, coal plus nuclear plus electrification through renewables versus the American bet on their strengths. Do you think the space has opened up for European, never mind politicians, for European populations to see this as a real choice yet? I don't think it has. Maybe I'm just talking about myself. I could see it happening, but I just don't think it's happened yet.
What I see, I think, is there's a lot, you can see it very much in the last few weeks. There's a lot of people in Europe. And it's interesting that the Greenland question seems to be the one that's pushed people over the edge, which I think, if you think about it historically, is quite odd, but leave that aside, is an alternative to the United States. And they so desperately want an alternative to the United States that they may well say, well, China, fine. And then if you say, well, what about Ukraine? They may say, well, okay, Ukraine, fine.
I mean, Ukraine fine in the sense, bye Ukraine.
Yeah, because very quickly you have to ask what the sacrifices that are being made for this turn are. And it's not just Ukraine, it's the welfare state in Europe. Unless you're going to say, well, we've so reset relations with Russia that we don't need to spend any more money on defense. That was just Trump going on at us, so we're fine. But again, I find that a little bit difficult to believe that that is going to be the reset. And so I think in terms of the desire, I think it is there. But as soon as the hard questions are asked about it, I'm like you. I'm not entirely at all convinced that most Europeans want to make the sacrifices that come with this. And this is before we've even got onto the question of giving up on trying to reindustrialize Europe through the energy transition, which has to involve, if that is the ambition, has got to involve some decoupling from China, not embracing China. So there's something else that's got to be given up on.
One last question. And then how much of all of this is the real contingency, not political choices and the contingent choices of political leaders, but actually contingent outcomes in the race to build the technology of the future? I mean, there are always technological contingencies as well. In our series about what ifs, we did a what if about the Haber-Bosch process, which is the thing that liberated Germany from guano and allowed it to fight the First World War. And it happened a couple of years before the First World War, the industrial production of ammonia. This contest about electrification and renewables is partly a competition to build the technology that allows this energy to be stored, in which I think the conventional wisdom, not least because of the Trump administration's choices, is that China has a clear lead. There is also an AI race going on, which is connected but different. And then there are all of the geopolitical questions around that, around Taiwan and so on. But when were we to look back in 20 years' time or in 50 years' time on this point, do you think, given the world that we're in now, the real contingencies are actually contingencies about technological breakthroughs? Or is that a sort of technologist's delusion? I'm not sure I think that, but I sometimes find myself feeling that actually when we look at the what ifs, it's going to be some story that comes out of either China or the United States, but almost certainly not Europe, about a breakthrough that we look back on and say that was the shift. That was the point where actually how these bets were going to cash out became clear, and we're not there yet.
The nitrogen story is a really interesting story because obviously it saves Germany in the First World War, and it also completely changes agriculture over the course of the 20th century in many other parts of the world. And so it's a pretty clear case of necessity being the mother of invention and then having transformative consequences. If there's a technological breakthroughs in terms of the storage of electricity at scale, I think that that would be comparable. And then that would also, I think, change certain aspects of geopolitical resource competition, because everybody, assuming that they could financially afford it, would be able to store domestically produced electricity. Now, unless you actually succeed in electrifying all the things that oil and gas do now, you're still going to have oil and gas as part of the story. So it doesn't eliminate the geopolitical competition over energy. I think the AI one is in part a red herring, not because I think that, AI might not be transformative in any number of ways, but it's pretty clear now that, I mean, it should have been always clear, but I think it's pretty well understood now that AI is very, electricity intensive. So it's not technology versus energy. It's the energy is a necessary condition of the technological advancement. So in order for the technological fix to come there, the technological fix has got to come for, in some sense, energy. The technology is needed to fix the energy problem before it can then be transformative in the terms of technology itself. I mean, I certainly don't think that we should at all underestimate the possibility that something at present that can't be seen is going to have a transformative effect on all these questions. Because if you just think about it in terms of the history of fossil fuels as an energy regime, and you look at it over the whole time period which fossil fuels have been in play, any number of times it looks like disaster, and yet it isn't. I mean, there's disasters that ensue from it, if you see what I mean. Any number of geopolitical catastrophes, total catastrophes that ensue from it. But that fundamental problem that you've got with fossil fuel extraction of depletion, of having a world that is dependent upon finite resources, that reckoning has never come, not at the global scale anyway. There's some fix. Either the commercial conditions change or the technological conditions change, actually, like you say, with steam engines, that allow you to do things in terms of extraction that weren't previously possible. So I think that, one shouldn't have like an apocalyptic view about where this is all heading. And that's not, I think, borne out by any historical consideration of what's come before, even though, as I say, the geopolitics of it does do some apocalyptic things, like think about the Nazis. I think that we have to see, though, that there is something in the present situation, including the way in which the energy regimes are being contested, not just within countries, but geopolitically contested, that does take us into some territory, if you like, in world history where we haven't really been before. And it goes back to the point I was making, the Churchill point I was making earlier. What doesn't happen in the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, is a contest about the energy regime. What is happening now is one. And I do think there is something that makes that quite uncertain, and it's quite hard to see what kind of technological fix there can be to that, unless there's something that is so, well, I guess fusion would be the fantasy that people have, that actually commercially scalable fusion that's practicable for every state in the world, however poor they are. And as soon as you start saying things like that, you can see that it sounds quite fantastical. That would eliminate this question. But I say, I don't see that that's a plausible future, really.
So in some ways, I might be summing you up wrong here. But in some ways, the weirdness of American power in the 20th century was a function of the fact that there wasn't really a contest and argument about the basis of the world's energy regime. And now we are in a world where that is the biggest question.
It's certainly a very central question, yeah.
It's a central question. And so it doesn't mean American power has peaked. It doesn't mean that the United States is still not going to do things that shape all of our lives in weird ways because it's a weird country. And by weird, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying it has its own very distinctive characteristics. But we're not in the era which the last century has been in many ways, that those things that you said were true and could be seen to be true in the early decades of the 20th century that shaped the future of the century, primarily about oil. We're not in that world anymore. So power is always weird. American power is not going to stop being weird. But that unusual period, the 20th century and early 21st century period, that probably is over because we're in a different set of competitions now to decide the future.
Yeah, and I think this is where what we're talking about in the first episode comes back in play, because the energy regime shift thing, to which Britain is obviously pivotal to the story, is coming at that same time as those last decades of imperial China, and the way in which, in some sense, the corpse of imperial China is being, or what's becoming the corpse of imperial China is becoming fought over. And because China was such an important state in world history prior to the crisis of imperial China, when you then play this energy regime contest out, and the two central players in it are the US and China, and the US's rise is also dependent upon that missing China at the end of the 19th century, that's an awful lot of things that are fused together around the same set of fault lines.
Next time, we are starting a new series. Over a series of episodes, I'm going to be talking to the political theorist Paul Sagar about political philosophy, and in particular, what's wrong with political philosophy at the moment. Why does it not help us make more sense of our very weird politics? And our answer is that we need to go back to the history of ideas. So over a series of episodes that cover everything from Aristotle to the philosopher Bernard Williams, we're going to be trying to make sense of the things that could help political philosophy make more sense of our world. That's next time. What's wrong with political philosophy? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.